Okay, we're going to start talking about special provisions for prior code buildings. And we're going to take off from where we left off. Okay. And we're going to start with exceptions 1, exception 2, exception 3, exception 5, and exception 16. Exception 1 relates to the plumbing, fuel gas, and mechanical codes. Am I too loud now? Is that good? Wait, say yes or no. Is this good? Okay. And you'll see that fire protection, elevators, accessibility, and structural is always that one section of the 901, the first section of 9, 30, 11, and 16. Plumbing, fuel gas, and mechanical are slightly different. And I'm going to walk you through each of these special provisions for prior code buildings so you get an understanding of how the code is organized and what it really means. And remember as we go through this that what we're really talking about is that I've elected to use the 1968 code, or where the 1968 code allows me to, I've elected the 1938 code. But there are some exceptions, and those exceptions relate to plumbing, fuel gas, mechanical, fire protection, accessibility, elevators, structural, all that stuff. These are things I'm not quite the 68 or 38 code. It's something in addition, something I have to do differently. And we'll go through those exceptions and those special provisions for prior code buildings for each of these categories. So let's talk about the plumbing, fuel gas, and mechanical. What does exception number 1 actually say? Exception number 1, and forgive me on slide 58 here, you will see that I have something underlined, and this is not the kind of underline that Helen Gittleson was talking about. This is underlined for emphasis. This underlining is not to indicate that it's new. The underline is just to bring your attention to it. And what exception number 1 says is that if you're doing work on stuff, I'll call it stuff, but you're doing that work on stuff which is regulated by the fuel gas code, the plumbing code, or the mechanical code, then you need to go to those codes to find out what we require, and it tells you there. You will be regulated by those codes, but go there and find out what it says. So let's do that and let's go there. We're going to go to the plumbing code, section 102, fuel gas code 102, mechanical code 102, and we'll go through each one in order. So let's do plumbing. And again, these underlines are for emphasis. They're not new text, they're for emphasis. In fact, this provision 102.4 already exists in the 2008 codes, and we retained it. It basically says that if I'm altering or repairing or renovating my plumbing systems, I'm going to comply with the 2008 codes. There's a bit of an exception that I can't be required to change parts and pieces I didn't want to replace. It's only to the extent of my alteration. And I can't replace something with a new code if it makes the old installation unsafe or hazardous. So I might still be able to use the old way of doing it. But generally, the general requirement is I'm always going to use the new 2014 code provisions. It even tells me that minor work and repairs and all just changes of stuff must be following the 2014 code unless it's done in the same manner as was the existing system. So there's an allowance for minor stuff. Okay. That hasn't changed. 102.4 and 102.4.1 have been on the books since 2008. What's new, and remember, the underlining is not showing you what's new. The underline is the emphasis I'm providing for the presentation purposes on slide 62. What's new is section 102.4.2 of the plumbing code. It says that in addition to the requirements of what we just told you, follow the following 3 sections as applicable to these prior code buildings. Now we remember what's a prior code building? It's something before 2008, right? Peter Stuyvesant's house, 1916, 1938, 1968, those are the prior code buildings. I will follow these special provisions for prior code buildings in 102.4.1.1 and 4.1.3. And when you go there, and I'm not going to read through them, you will see that there is a special allowance for plumbing fixture calculations. And that's important because people came to us and said, what happens if I have a 1968 code building, I'm renovating it under the 68 code, and it was built to the 68 code using the table from the old plumbing table, but now for some reason, are you going to make me use the new tables? No, we're not going to make you. And this makes it clear that you can use either one. It just happens that in many cases, the 2014 code is more lenient and you'll do better, but it may not always be that way. And this makes it clear that you can do either one. And that was a question we got from a lot of people, and the committee wanted that information provided in the code, and there it is. We also talk about seismic supports, but don't get scared. Seismic supports, it tells you that you can use the seismic requirements that were applicable under the 1968 code. It really reinforces that the 68 code is still applicable, and we have that flow chart for alterations that is in the TPPN. It's as it always was, but it makes it clearer. And then wind resistance, it points you to BC Building Code Chapter 16, and you'll see that the attachments on the roofs might need to be designed to modern wind codes, not the 1938 wind codes, which are not very strong. And you'll see that when we get to the Chapter 16 special provisions. So that's all it is. We go through all this to find out that there are 3 plumbing provisions. And that was 102.4. Now you see where this is going. I'm going to do fuel gas code next. Okay, so again, this underlining is for emphasis on slide 65. Exception number 1, fuel gas code. We send you to FGC 102.4, and it tells you that the alterations, renovations, or repairs shall comply with what's required for new work, 2014 code, but without requiring the existing alterations to comply with all the existing requirements. So I can't be made to upgrade the whole system by changing a bolt here, okay? So I only have to comply with new code if it doesn't make me replace the rest. And I also have to comply only to the extent that it doesn't make me replace the rest of it, if it makes it unsafe, hazardous, or overloaded. It further tells me that the minor work and repairs can be done in the same manner as the old. I can replace a bolt with a bolt, a valve with a valve, in the same manner as it always was, as long as that's not hazardous. And those 2 provisions I read were already on the books since 2008. The only new provision in the fuel gas code is 102.4.2. Okay, I read this, and how many sections do I have to deal with? It says 102.4.1.1 and 4.1.4. So there are 4 new provisions which are special provisions for prior code buildings. And you'll see that the first one was an issue we had to issue a buildings bulletin about because there was a lot of confusion about fuel gas piping within rated assemblies. Now, it's a big deal to architects and specifiers who are trying to figure out where do I put my gas piping. I have a UL listed assembly, and that UL listed assembly was tested for 2 hours without flammable gases inside of it. So I'm not supposed to put the flammable gas inside of that listed assembly, otherwise it doesn't fulfill its function anymore, so I've got to put it on one side or the other. And this makes it clear, we think, in conjunction with that bulletin that we issued before, what that means. It also talks about guards and access to roofs and elevated structures. What happens if I put a new boiler on the roof? The mechanical code says that I need railing if that boiler on the roof is next to the edge. That's how you design a new building. But what about a 1968 code or 38 code building that never had the railings? And I put that new boiler up there. Do I have to provide the railing? Does it apply? It tells you in that section when you do and when you don't. The punchline is, yes, you do have to put it there if it's a new piece of equipment in a new location, but if you're replacing the old equipment in the old location, we are not going to mandate a railing to comply with the fuel gas code. Okay, and that's very logical when you think about it. Now, we would always urge you to put that railing in, but the code is not going to mandate that it be put in. Seismic supports, same thing. Do I need to provide seismic supports for my piping? Well, it depends. When was your building built? Before or after, Gus, 1988? 95, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of UBC 88, right? Which is in the 95 edition, which became effective in 1996, right? You'll go to the 68 code to figure that out, and you go through our flow chart. Wind resistance, same thing. It's got to be bolted down to the new code if it's on the roof or whatever. And you'll see that when we get to structural. So now this is becoming old hat. You know where I'm going to do next, right? I'm going to go to mechanical. Mechanical, 102.4. And again, the underlining is for my emphasis. It's not new text. And in fact, 102.4 is exactly as it was in the '08 code, which is that if you're doing alterations to your mechanical systems, you're going to use the 2014 code, but without requiring the entire system to be upgraded, and not in any way that would cause the existing system to become unsafe, overloaded, or hazardous. However, my minor alterations, additions, renovations, or repairs can be done in the way that the prior system was installed, as long as it's not unsafe, not hazardous. And the only new provision in the mechanical code, just like the others, is 102.4.2. Special provisions for prior code buildings, all new text. It says, in addition to what we told you before, I'm going to do how many sections here? 6 new sections. The mechanical committee was a lot more vocal than the plumbing committee, which only had 3. The mechanical committee came up with 6 things they wanted to talk about. Okay, so let's see what those 6 things are. Fire and smoke dampers. This is a big deal. Let's say I have a high-rise office building built in 1922. Does anyone know what the fire ratings on those columns are? 4 hours. The floors, 3 hours. That building's not going anywhere. When you look at the 2014 mechanical code, it wants fire dampers, smoke dampers all over the place. But the fire ratings can be much lower. The passive fire resistance in a modern high-rise is much lower. So it compensates for the lack of compartmentation, it compensates for the lack of fire rating by the addition of lots of fire and smoke dampers. And if I'm renovating that 1922 high-rise with 4-hour columns and 3-hour floors and 2-hour quarters and all that stuff, when you start putting those ducts, you're putting in a lot of redundancy that's really not necessary for the type of building. And what this code section says clarifies that our department accepts the determination as to whether or not a damper is required to be based on the code under which the building was built, in which case it would be the '68 code. You go to RS-13, whatever it is, and you'll figure out when you can omit all those dampers. You don't have to use the mechanical code to determine when a damper is required. Now, once you need that damper, because the '68 code would require it, I will use the 2014 code's technical standards. What UL listing does it have? How is it connected? All that stuff. That I can do. But this saves a lot of redundancy and excess dampers in buildings that are designed to not require all that extra stuff. And that was an important thing for the mechanical committee. Okay. Next, guards and access to roofs and elevated structures, same as the fuel gas code. I'm putting a new piece of equipment on the roof. If it's near the edge of the roof and there's no railing, I'm going to put a railing if it's new equipment in a new location. But if there was a chiller there, I'm replacing the chiller, my code is not going to be the one to mandate you put in new railings. Now, you should anyway. We hope that you do. There may be reasons why you don't, but our code will only require it for new equipment in new locations. And when you read 102.4.2.2, you'll see that. Okay, so vibration isolation for cooling towers. There is an exception that the mechanical committee wanted related to when it's not practical to install the isolation dampers for a replacement cooling tower because it doesn't fit for some other reason, and you'll see that there. There's an exception for non-combustible fill or combustible fill for certain cooling towers in certain conditions because in certain alteration work, you might not be able to accomplish it. And then the seismic supports, it will again send you back to the '68 code to determine whether or not seismic supports are necessary for mechanical work. And then the wind resistance. You're going to bolt it down to the roof in accordance with the wind standards for new construction. Okay, so that's mechanical. And what I've gone through is the plumbing, the fuel gas, and the mechanical. And that's all good. That's slide 74. And I've explained, I hope, in enough detail, exception 1, so that you can navigate and find where your answer is when you're dealing with that. Okay, so let's go now to the others on our list. I'm still going to do exception 2, 3, 5, and 16. Fire protection systems. When you go to 28101.4.3, that list of 19 exceptions, there's number 2. And remember, the underlining here is for emphasis. It's not what's new about it. The whole thing is really rewritten and new. All it does is say, go to chapter 9. It doesn't here list, change of use, follow code, whatever. So it says go to chapter 9. And remember where those provisions are found, right? 901. It's the first section of chapter 9. And 901, last subsection, 901.9. There already was a 901.1, 901.2, all the way through 901.8. Now there's a new 901.9. And here we have those special provisions for prior code buildings. Now we know what a prior code building is. Peter Stuyvesant's house, right? It's anything built before 2008. And it talks about 901.9.1 through 901.9.6. There are 6 subsections for prior code buildings for fire protection systems. And it will tell you what to do when I have elected the 68 code or the 38 code, and I have to, for some reason, pick those codes. I still have to do certain things here, and this will tell you. So 901.9.1 will look eerily familiar because it's the same language from the fuel, gas, mechanical, and plumbing code about new work shall comply, but you're not going to overload or make things unsafe or hazardous. Okay, so I'm going to breeze through that because you have the presentations on your iPads probably. I'll go through the next. And this also looks familiar. It's very similar. That minor stuff, you can do the minor stuff just like the stuff that's there, provided that it's not hazardous. Okay, change a bolt, change a nut, change a valve. How about a change of occupancy? Now I'm in 901.9.2. I'm in the second new thing that was added for fire protection systems. And this clarifies what was in the old exception number 2. It will tell you in 901.9.2 that you will make the entire building comply with the fire protection requirements if the main use or dominant occupancy is changed, or to the space if you're changing the space, the occupancy group or usage of the space. And you'll see that it spells it out, we think, a little more clearer than it was in the old exception number 2. Subsection 3, so on the third bullet of fire protection systems, talks about enlargements. There was always a question, well, does my enlarged portion have to comply with fire protection systems? It says if I change the use of a space, I have to comply. Is a newly created enlargement a change of a use from thin air into space of some kind? We say yes, and here it is. The enlarged portions must be provided with fire protection systems, and then we have the exception. If I have a one-family house, and I'm building an extension, and if that one-family house should have been a sprinklered building because it's more than 4 stories or whatever, I might not have to do it. There are other reasons why. If I'm changing the main use or dominant occupancy, I might still have to do sprinklers because there's a bigger alteration, but just that little enlargement is not going to be the reason to trigger that enlargement for a 1 or 2 family house. Okay. Now I'm on subsection 4 of fire protection. Subsection 4 is value of alterations. Now this looks like the engineers will feel more comfortable with this, I think. VA, or value of alterations, is greater than or equal to 60%. This takes into account those provisions from Title 27 that says if I exceed more than 60% of my cost renovating my building, I'm going to comply with the 68 code. In this case, we're replacing that with the fire protection requirements of the 2014 code. And you'll read it and you'll see, so now I will comply with BC 9 if I exceed 60%. If I'm between 30 and 60, I'm going to provide compliance with altered parts. And this third bullet was not meant to confuse you, but it was meant to carry over the existing provisions. The existing provisions in the 68 code had a 60% threshold for all buildings except for apartment buildings. And then for apartment buildings, the trigger was 50%. And that was because of Local Law 10 of 99. And in crafting this new legislation, the intent was not to change the world significantly, but to maintain the same triggers until we get to the existing building code and we can rehash it and rethink it. So this ought not to be changing the world. There are little changes because Local Law 10 of 99 was specifically and only about sprinkler systems. The way this is worded now, if I exceed 50% of the value of the building for an apartment building, it's not just sprinklers. I might also need to put in a fire alarm system connected to central station for the water flow alarm or elevator lobbies or something. I might need to do that too, and that wasn't Local Law 10, but at least it's simplified that if I exceed the 50% for an apartment building, I look at Chapter 9 and do what it says. Okay, so it's a little simpler, a little bit of change, but not so much when you look at the triggers. That's value of alterations, 5. Now let's go to some specific things. 5 has I'm on the 5th one for fire protection systems, and there's some subsections here. It was always very complicated to explain to the applicants how to provide for smoke alarms in apartments. Okay, I'm not talking about detectors in a big building. I'm talking about apartments, houses. In 1985, or 83, we required smoke alarms for apartments. When was it, Keith? 81, 82, we required smoke alarms. Battery ones, they stick them on the wall, the whole city got them. And then we added 1 and 2 family houses a few years later than that. And new construction was required to have hardwired, but old buildings were required to have batteries. When we came to the 2008 codes, it was a different world. We want a smoke alarm inside the bedroom and outside the bedroom, at least one on every floor of the unit, and they all have to be interconnected. Much more complicated system. It's still 120-volt wiring. The electricians can do it. They know how to do it. They do it everywhere else in the country. They can do that here too. That's fine. But what happens when you're renovating, and how do you trigger that? This new code provision will tell you that if you remove the existing and or installation of new interior wall or ceiling finishes, permitting the installation of concealed wiring for all the required alarms throughout the dwelling unit, that's when you upgrade. Okay? So if I'm only renovating the one bedroom and the rest, the plaster finishes are staying intact, I don't have to upgrade to the new smoke alarms. But if I'm gutting the apartment, that's when we want you to do the whole thing. That way you might have a mix of old and new, whatever it is, but this was intended to clarify that, and this is based on provisions in the International Residential Code, with a little modification, but that's where that comes from. Okay. Standpipes. I'm not going to walk through this because I think it will take too long. But suffice it to say that in these subsections of 5, 901.9.5, I'm in 2, 3, and 4, we talk about how to treat enlargements to buildings with standpipes. If I have one stair with a standpipe and one stair without a standpipe and I'm enlarging, do I have to put the standpipe in the other staircase? Maybe, maybe not, depending on the height. What if I have a building with no standpipes and I'm enlarging the height of the building? Do I have to put in standpipes in both of them? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the height and these things. What if I have an existing building and I'm tearing out the staircases and putting a new staircase in? Do I put in the standpipe? Maybe, maybe not. Read what it says. I mean, that's where we are with this, okay? So if you're enlarging and it involves standpipes, we now have a special provision for prior code buildings that walks you through those steps. And, of course, we send you to seismic supports. Again, that will say the same thing as the fuel gas, same thing as the mechanical, same thing as the plumbing. If I'm in a fire protection system, do I need sway bracing? Do I need as a minimum code requirement to worry about those things for purposes of submitting plans that are compliant with my code? It will depend. What this provision says is that you use the code that was in effect when the building was built. I shouldn't say that. You use the 68 code, I should say, for your prior code building. So whereas the 2014 code might have required it, you're going to go back to the 68 code. The 68 code has a TPPN that explains when you have to worry, when you don't. What's the extent of the alteration? Are you increasing the height of the building such that the differential something or other, the engineers will tell you, yes or no, and that TPPN will explain whether the extent of your alteration requires this. If your building was built after 1996, it already has seismic, and the alterations to that post-96 building will have to comply with the UBC provisions of 88 modified to 92, whatever it was. The engineers know what I'm talking about. Okay. So I've talked about the plumbing, the fuel gas, the mechanical. I've talked about the fire protection, which has very similar types of provisions. I'm now going to walk you through the elevators, the accessibility, and the structural. And remember, these are all special provisions for prior code buildings. They are provisions where I'm sent there because of an exception. I'm using the 68 code or the 38 code on my prior code building, but these exceptions say, but there's some stuff I have to worry about. In this case, I'm going to talk about the elevators. The exception in the admin code simply says that you will comply with Chapter 30 and Appendix K for your elevator work, subject to special provisions for prior code buildings set forth in Chapter 30. We can go there, and remember how there were either 4 or 3 or 5 provisions. Elevators only has one. The elevator committee came up with one thing they wanted and felt strongly about making clear in the code here. Prior code buildings shall be permitted to comply with section 3001.11.1, and it talks about existing shafts. Well, you can't fit a round peg in a square hole, right? If I have an elevator cab that is to be newly installed in an existing elevator shaft, and that shaft is already a certain size, this code provision will say that you don't have to comply with the minimum size requirements for the interior of your elevator, let's say a stretcher-sized elevator, if the shaft already exists. Makes sense. I have an existing shaft. I want to replace my elevator. My examiners ought not to be telling you, you have to make the shaft bigger because the elevator code says it's got to be a certain size. I've got an existing shaft and I'm replacing the elevator. Now, there is an exception. If it's otherwise mandated to be larger pursuant to 1101.3, those are the accessibility provisions. Let's say I'm exceeding 50% of the cost of the building, I'm changing the main use or dominant occupancy. In those cases, we will find out in a few moments, accessibility requirements may require full compliance with all the accessibility provisions, as if it were a new building. If that's the case, then this exception doesn't apply. You'd have to make the elevator bigger and or get a waiver and go through that process. But generally, I'm replacing my elevator, I get to put back the same size elevator. I don't have to make it bigger, even if I'm in a building that should have had a stretcher-sized elevator. So we've talked about elevators. Let's talk about accessibility. Okay. Mr. Keith Wen will be walking you through the changes to accessibility provisions of Chapter 11 later this afternoon after lunch. I urge you to get back from lunch exactly on time. You will not want to miss his performance. It's going to be very exciting. Right, Keith? It will be. If anyone can make accessibility exciting, it is Keith Wen. So I urge you to come back. But my bit, all I'm going to talk about is the triggers and the application of the provisions he's going to talk about to a prior code building. That's all I'm going to talk about. Okay, so we first start at 28.101.4.3. We look at what's the exception say? For those of you who know exception 5 now, it tells you the 50% threshold and the change of it doesn't say that anymore here. Chapter 5 just sends you directly to Chapter 11 and look at the special provisions for those prior code buildings. If you have a 68 code or a 38 code or a prior code, any prior code building, and you're doing alterations, yes, you get to use the 68 code, and yes, you might be able to use the 38 code if the 68 code says so, but you've got to go to Chapter 11 to find out what it says for accessibility. And you look at the bottom here, look what's been repealed. That is 95% of Local Law 58 of 87. When you say, I've got to comply with Local Law 58, it's really off the books now. 27.123.1 has been repealed as of October 1. 27.929.1 through 17, that's all been repealed, starting October 1. So let's look at that provision. Remember, it's the first section of 1101, last subsection. Currently, there is only an 1101.1, 1101.2. Now we get to 1101.3, the new words. This says that we have 3.1 through 3.5. So we have count them, 5 provisions that are special provisions for prior code buildings for accessibility. Now, at the bottom of slide number 92, I have technical standards. It says here, the 2014 code, the 2014 code must be used unless stated, which means that what we used to use, which was, for those of you who still remember the 68 code, are we getting past it that far back yet? Reference standard RS 4-6 and ANSI A117.1 1986 as amended therein is no longer available unless specifically stated. Okay? That means that when you look at 3.1 through 3.5 of 1101, we're going to be using the new standards. We're not looking backwards. We're not looking at that old book anymore. That old ANSI book is really not in your vocabulary anymore. Ought not to be. We're looking forward, and we're going to use the new standards going forward. And there's a good reason for that. The old standards don't comply with a lot of the federal standards, and the new ones, by and large, do. And we don't want applicants getting in a place where they may be following what it says in my book and not complying with the latest. So let's go forward. What are those 5 provisions? 1101.3. Before I get to the 5 provisions, there are some blanket exceptions. The blanket exceptions are ordinary repairs. Ordinary repairs are ordinary course of maintenance. If I am replacing a doorknob, that's the ordinary course of maintenance. If I'm replacing a nosing on one stair, that's the ordinary course of maintenance. It's an ordinary repair. You know we have something else called a minor alteration. A minor alteration is not done in the ordinary course of maintenance, not necessarily. It could be done outside the ordinary course of maintenance. And a minor alteration, for most cases, does not need a permit, a work permit from us, and ordinary repairs don't need a work permit. But they're very distinct and different things. The only place that I know of in the codes where that distinction is exceedingly important is BC 11. If I am replacing all of the windows and patio doors in a building, it's a big major capital improvement to the shareholders or the tenants, that's not the ordinary course of maintenance. So this exception for ordinary repairs does not apply to that. So if I have patio doors on apartments all throughout a building, and now the new ones I'm putting back have a step, I can't do that because it makes it worse. I'm subject to the accessibility provision. And that's the way it's always been since 1987. Ordinary course of maintenance is accepted. The second thing that's accepted are R3 occupancies that are pre-1991. Now, you can read the exact section to find out what date and intended for first occupied, whatever that language is, you can read it. But 1991 is in your head. If it's a pre-91 R3 building, I'm not going to have to worry about this. Those old brownstones, don't have to worry about it. Post-91, I might have to worry about it. I have to worry about it if it was built with 4 or more units in a single structure. Now, 4 or more units in a single structure, I'm not going to explain. That's a term of art for those of you who know the Fair Housing Act. It's not necessarily what you think. 4 row houses built next to each other could be a single structure, even if they have firewalls. Maybe, maybe not. But those are the exceptions. I don't have to worry about 1101 for ordinary repairs done in the ordinary course of maintenance. I don't have to worry for old R3s, and I don't have to worry about it for new R3s if they were built with fewer than 4 in a single structure. So let's go through them. How many did I say there were? I said that there were 5 of them. So let's go to the first one. Change of occupancy or use. And what you will find in number 1 is that we have subsumed the provisions from Local Law 58, and we've subsumed some of the TPPNs in one place. It will tell you if I change the main use or dominant occupancy, I'm going to comply with the 2014 code for accessibility as if it were hereafter erected. Okay? That shouldn't be a change or a shock. That's the way it's always been. It also says that if I change the occupancy group or zoning use group, I have to make that space comply throughout. So if I change, a bank to a restaurant, the whole thing has to comply, bathrooms, spaces, everything, as if it were new. And we've included in the code the TPPN, which says, and an accessible route to the space if you are within 18 inches of the sidewalk. Same way it's always been, same thing we've always known, but at least it's in one place. And number 3 talks about a route to a space if the prior occupancy or usage would not have required an accessible route for new construction. And the typical example for that is a roof deck. I have a building, it does not have elevator to the roof, but the roof is open for no purpose. I want to now put a deck up there for the public to use. If new construction would have required an accessible route, you have to provide that accessible route. And that's the way we've been interpreting it for many years. It's caught some people off guard. We say it up front. Now, it doesn't mean you can't get a waiver. Go to the MOPD and request a recommendation back to us, and we'd review that. But the baseline condition is what it says in number 3, and you can read the more specifics when you read 1101.3.1, item number 3. So now I'm up to number 2. I said there were 5. Number 2 of 11. 1101.3.2. Now we're into that calculation thing again, the engineering formula. It's not so scary. If the value of the alterations exceeds 50% of the building value, the whole building will comply as if it were a new building. And if it's less, and I notice I don't have a less than or equal to, so one of these is, there's a cusp there I didn't quite get, and you can look up the exact answer. Less than 50%, then the altered or repaired portions will comply to the extent of the alteration. That's the same as we've always had in Local Law 58. So if I have a 15-story apartment building, I'm renovating the bathroom and moving things around, to the extent of that renovation, I'm going to comply. Okay? Now, of course, it excludes ordinary repairs, ordinary course of maintenance, changing a faucet valve fitting or something like that, fine. It also has an allowance here. If I have a pre-1991 R2 unit, and now you know what we're talking about with R2. We're talking about apartments. Everybody's apartment is an R2. The bathrooms and powder rooms may follow prototype layouts established by the department by rule. Prototype. We use that word in the law. Ding, 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 ding. You know what that means, right? Who here knows what that means, the prototype? What would you think it means? Did I hear TPPN? Okay. So the TPPN had certain allowances for residential R2 apartments and made descriptions and pictorial formats of how you would accomplish compliance with Local Law 58. And for those pre-1991 buildings, which were prior to fair housing, this code will allow alterations to be made on the 15th floor. I'm just renovating the bathroom in accordance with those prototype layouts. Eventually, we will write a rule to make that permanent, but we will continue to honor that TPPN until we come up with new ones, but that is what's intended. You will notice that it doesn't apply to the kitchens. For the kitchens, you will go to the R2 units you're going to hear about from Mr. Wen later. For the doors and everything else, you'll follow the 2014 code for any alteration now. Because remember, if you're less than 50%, the altered or repaired part will comply with BC 11, not Local Law 58, BC 11. You go to BC 11 for everything now. The exception is a pre-1991 unit will do this. If I have a post-1991 unit, they already ought to have complied with fair housing, and therefore those prototype layouts will not be available when our examiners review. Get that right? Okay. Now, directional accessibility signage. The identifying accessibility signage. Those two requirements, items number 3 and items number 4, were added by the City Council between 2008 and 2014. We've brought them over. And it basically will tell you that if I have a prior code building and for some reason I have one bathroom that's accessible and one that's not, and I'm altering that space, I've got to make sure that signage is installed in the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to point people to the accessible routes and the accessible features that are not, when there are some that are not accessible. Now, you won't normally allow that or even find those in new construction because our standards are so stringent normally. Okay, I've got 10 minutes, that's good. And then the waiver provisions. The 5th item in accessibility are the waiver provisions. We have repealed 27292.6, which are the waiver provisions, and we have moved them up word for word, verbatim, into 1101.3.5. So that is the place you will look to for the standards. Is it an undue hardship, physical impracticability, legally impossible? All those provisions and the standards that the mayor's office for people with disabilities will look to determine whether you are granted a waiver will be in there in 1101.3.5. Okay. So now let's talk about structural. Structural. LRFD, load resistance factor design. Miracle of modern engineering, right? This allows the calculation of live loads and the applicability of seismic and wind loads to be governed by 1601.2. So let's go to 1601.2. And it sends you through 4 subsections, okay? The first one are calculations. And it tells you that you can use the 2014 code's formulas and calculations even if you're using the 68 code and the 38 code, which is a good thing, because some of those formulas and calculations from the 1938 code are very complex and they're not in our common usage anymore. It also allows that LRFD, which I talked about. If you use that method of calculation, that shall not be deemed to reduce the structural safety. If you're a structural engineer, that's a big deal. It was a complication. Did it apply? Did it not apply? Could I use it? Could I not? That says explicitly you can. Okay. And specifically for live loads, you can use the tables from the 68 code or the 38 code in terms of your live load floors is 100 pounds per square foot or whatever. Now, that's important because the 2008 code might not have those provisions anymore, and this makes it crystal clear that when you're using the 68 code or 38 code buildings, that you can use the old tables, even if you want to use the formulas from the 2014 code. So the structural engineers now have a lot more flexibility to do things which they always knew was the right answer, which will give them the safe results, but it clearly says that they can do it. So let's move on. Seismic loads, this is the same thing. If you're doing a prior code building, you use the 68 code. The 68 code will say if I'm pre-1996, I use a flow chart to determine if I have to build seismic into my design. And if I'm post-1996, I will use the seismic requirements that were in effect at that time for my alteration. Wind loads. This is the provision that the fuel gas, mechanical, and plumbing code sent you to. Equipment, appliances, and their supports shall meet the wind pressures in BC 1609. That's the new building code. So if I'm bolting something on the roof, it should not fly off the roof, right? Number 2 closes a loophole, which is that glass, if you do facades, those kind of things, glass cannot be designed to the 1938 code. When you look at the 1938 code, depending on how the building, there may be no design criteria whatsoever. So in a perverse way, I could have gone from the 2008 code, allow me to use the 1968 code, which allows me to use the 38 code, which allows me to have no design for the glass in my building. This says, no, you can't use the 38 code. At most, you can use the 68 code when you do your glass. You can always use the 08 code, but if you go back to the 68 code, you can't go back to 38 code for glass. And don't worry, very few people would design this way. That would be not very safe, but it at least makes it clear. The next thing is when you're doing certain enlargements, you'll have to show that the entire structure meets minimal wind loads, that you don't increase the wind surface area greater than 5% or decrease the lateral force capacity by greater than 20%. If you do either of those two things, you have to show some minimal structural stability, and most buildings that exist already meet that. There are some frame buildings, some other things where if you actually added a story to a frame building, the thing would not meet minimum wind loads, and that you'll read in item number 3 of 1601.2.4, that issue. So I have 5 minutes for questions. That leaves me about 3 questions. Yeah. Oh, we'll do the questions at the end, right? So I'm going to do this. I'm going to introduce Marshall Kaminer with the sheet that I didn't bring up. I had it here. It's on my seat. Okay. You want to give me a round of applause? Okay. I'm going to now introduce our next speaker. His name is Marshall Kaminer. He currently serves as the executive engineer for the Technical Affairs and Code Development Division of the New York City Department of Buildings. His duties include interpreting the New York City construction codes, the zoning resolution, and the multiple dwelling law. He also serves on technical subcommittees responsible for periodic updates of the New York City construction codes and the New York State Code. In addition, he assists in the writing of bulletins and rules to clarify the texts of these codes, laws, and other related new legislation. Mr. Kaminer regularly teaches this technical material to the department staff and to industry. I have information about all his degrees, but someone cut it out. He's very smart. Okay, thank you.